Now, Kate, in your cover piece this week, you talk about the fact that not so long ago, maybe a few weeks, the British government seemed to be on a roll. The vaccine rollout was going very well. The government seemed to have a clear strategy as to what it was doing in terms of fighting COVID. And in the last 3 weeks, that's all gone a bit wrong and everything's become a little bit unhinged. What has actually happened?
Well, ministers don't want to talk about it, but they were pursuing a strategy of herd immunity for the autumn, not the way it was previously talked about when you would just have mass infection with no vaccines to protect the vulnerable, but one in which people were building up antibodies either through natural infection, but predominantly now through vaccination. A very different kind of strategy from the one before, but still one where we reached herd immunity come September, October time. And the Delta variant changed that equation. It's far more contagious, and they think that the threshold to achieve herd immunity is much higher. And so the fact that there seems to be more vaccine hesitancy among the young has meant that they've ramped up rhetoric that does not sound so much like Freedom Day, but actually a very new and quite sinister normal, where we're not going back to our old ways, but we're ushering in a new era where we will have a tiered society, where people who are double jabbed will have significantly more rights to travel, to access certain kinds of venues than people who aren't jabbed. And I think there are a lot of issues with this. One, the fact that we have not even had a proper debate in Parliament yet. The second, that ministers promised in the wintertime, Michael Gove, Nadhim Zawahi, former Health Secretary Matt Hancock, that they weren't even considering something like this. Nadhim Zawahi called it discriminatory, which it would be by nature. And yet now we're in a situation where the government is announcing it as a fact. As I say in the cover piece, some people are calling their bluff. They're saying the government does not actually intend to bring in vaccine passports. This is a cynical ploy to get more young people to take up the vaccine. But I think, it almost doesn't matter whether it's cynical or not, although it certainly will matter if it's not and they're planning to bring them in and our lives change in that way. It's a fundamental break in the trust that we were supposed to have in our government, that they were leading us through this and being honest every step of the way. Now we're at a point where they're saying to us, I'm sorry, but it's not going to be as it once was. We're moving into something that looks a lot more like a biosecurity state, and it's not obvious that this is what people have signed up for.
I want to get back to vaccine passport in seconds, but Mark, first of all, the Delta variant has happened. We can't really blame the government for the Delta variant, but perhaps we can blame the government, don't you think, for suggesting hope that was perhaps beyond its reach?
Well, I mean, it is a communications balance between being, hopelessly optimistic or indeed severely pessimistic. And I mean, that is a very challenging line to follow. But I really disagree with the idea that there's something sinister going on here. And this has sort of become almost a libertarian battleground. But I think one's got to look at it rather carefully, because of course, it's people's liberty, in a sense, not to have a vaccine and to receive the harms that flow if you get infected. But the issue here is that vaccination protects you from infecting other people. And so that's a quite different argument. And in many countries, including the United States, you basically can't go to school until you've had a whole set of vaccines. You can't go to Harvard if you don't have an annual flu injection. In France and in Italy, compulsory vaccinations in childhood are the norm and have been for a long time. There are all sorts of situations where we legislate behaviour, and to some extent it is not only to protect yourself but others. Seatbelts, there are all sorts of examples. And so it doesn't seem to me to be the most sort of terrible thing that actually, if you want to go into an environment and it is basically indoors, crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where transmission is most likely to happen, then actually saying, well, if you want to do that, then you need to have 2 vaccines. This is not really a fundamental assault on liberty.
I suppose I see what you're saying, but I suppose the objection, and I don't think it's just mad libertarians that think this, is that there seemed to be a public debate, and the government seemed to have, in fact, said it was not going to go ahead with with vaccine passports, particularly not domestic vaccine passports, and yet now it's happening. So people feel that there's a sort of frivolous public debate that actually doesn't happen, and there's no parliamentary scrutiny, as Kate says, And then these things
I
go ahead.
It's clearly a good thing to have a public debate, and we're having the debate here, and I think that's absolutely fine. But of course, as the facts change, people have to change their plans. And, this is, in a sense, one I don't really like using sort of warlike metaphors, but the virus obeys one set of laws, which is the laws of Darwinian evolution. Essentially, those variants of the virus that make it able to transmit more easily, and those behaviors by humans that make it easier to transmit more easily, are good for the virus and bad for us. And the challenge is, it's not as though this is a completely benign disease if you're young. It's predominantly young people that are ending up in hospital. And if they've had a pneumonia, even if it doesn't kill them, there's a significant risk that they'll have quite long-term lung disease. And so the sort of spectre of long COVID, which is a whole variety of different things, is quite significant. And it's a much nastier infection than flu, and you don't really want to have flu either. So it seems to me that, the government did not anticipate that they would have 50,000 cases a day nearly of a new variant at the time when they were hoping to open up. The vaccination program has been an extraordinary success, but perhaps not surprisingly, as it reaches younger age groups who feel themselves more sort of immortal, there is a bit more hesitancy. And this does two things. I mean, it does actually, if introduced in this form, it does incentivize them to do it.
Well, can we say the vaccination...
At the end of the day, that's got to be a good thing to do.
Can we say the vaccination program has been such a success? Certainly the initial rollout was successful, but it seems to be slowing down, and it seems that the vaccine is not as successful in stopping transmission as was first anticipated.
Well, no, it was never. I mean, frankly, the vaccines have been much more successful than the scientific community expected in the first place. To get some, firstly, almost 90% of adults have now had one vaccine dose, and they're heading towards a second dose. That's a pretty successful program. I mean, much more than in almost every other country in the world. And secondly, it's always recognised that there's a sort of threshold of effectiveness of vaccines. And what the vaccines are doing is they are largely protecting, though not completely, people against the most severe effects of disease. So they are reducing hospitalizations and they are reducing deaths. There's no doubt about that. But they are a bit less effective at introducing mild symptomatic disease and asymptomatic disease. Frankly, this is, humans against natural biology. It's very difficult to overcome the forces of nature, and vaccines have been, arguably, alongside clean water, the major public health measures that have changed human health and survival over the last couple of centuries.
It seems as though the government has learned from the example of France in this particular instance, because the French saw an uptake in vaccination rates among young people when they introduced a little, as you would call it, nudge, as others might say, coercion, into society. Kate, do you think, you say that vaccine hesitancy will increase with coercion, but the example of France suggests that it won't, and that what Mark calls an inertia might go down with a bit more nudging?
Well, I think if you're genuinely vaccine hesitant, I think, seeing the way that this narrative has changed is probably going to shove you towards the skeptic direction. But as we write in this week's magazine, the heavy fist of the state can actually be very convincing. And in France, we're seeing mass protests, but we've also seen uptake of the jab amongst young people, I think, go up at roughly 75% since he brought in such extreme vaccine passport rules. It can work. The question is whether or not as a society we are comfortable with this kind of not nudge but force, the threat that you will deprive a person of their liberty because they're not doing something that you're claiming is voluntary. We also have to remember that the government is still very insistent that these vaccines are voluntary, but they're just going to continue to take away parts of your life until you do what they want. And it's moving. But just very quickly, it's moving. It's moving very fast. About a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, the government published its guidance for business saying that they would help them to develop a system to check people's vaccination status. It was voluntary, with a little note at the bottom saying, if you don't do this, by the way, we do reserve the right to make you. Less than 2 weeks later, they're making them. And this is what's so incredible, is that they're working with the narrative of choice, and yet they're bringing in this force. And because Parliament hasn't been sitting properly, we haven't had the chance to call this out properly and say, wait a second, we have not actually signed up or agreed to this. It goes against our principles. Is it really worth doing this?
But the paradox in a way is that actually the UK is probably the only country in the world that's sort of taken off the brakes in terms of social interaction at a time when the case numbers are rising. And, you know, the fear is that when you've got 50,000 a day, and we haven't really talked about all the pings, but I mean, the pings actually reflect the fact that lots of people are being exposed to people who've tested positive. I mean, the app is actually doing what it's supposed to do, although inevitably there are some false positives and indeed false negatives amongst that. So that's the paradox, which is that actually this is a government that doesn't actually like legislative controls on behaviour. So the brakes have come off. But it's at a time when the COVID car, as it were, is travelling at 90 miles an hour down a hill. That's the challenge. And so, you know, are they going to be forced to introduce more rules depending on what happens with the numbers? And what the modelling does show is that if you are cautious, and the guidance is to be cautious, then we're likely to have a smaller peak than if you simply return to complete pre-COVID behaviour. So, you know, it's a dilemma for the government in a way, which is they've got a fast accelerating car. Are they going to put some form of rules back on the environments where the transmission is likely to be most rampant?
But lastly then, Mark, I mean, do you think the problem then is not, obviously, that there is some Orwellian state in the making, but just that the government doesn't have a clue what it's doing, and in a way that's more sinister?
Well, I mean, I pity the policymaker. It's a very, very difficult job they've got at the moment. I mean, this is one of the toughest sets of decisions. And, I mean, it's going to be scrutinised in the finest detail for years to come. But it is genuinely difficult when you've got a virus that, as I say, is not really interested in policy at all. It's a very, very successful virus, this one, actually, and it will continue to mutate. So they're having to make decisions on the hoof. And, you know, I would rather have policymakers who change their minds in the face of the facts changing. And I mean, the mantra for some months has been data, not dates, although the dates have been pretty dominant in some of the decision-making recently. But having said that, I would like policymakers to respond to evidence.
Kate, it's very easy for journalists like us to criticise to criticise the government in what is an unprecedented crisis. Should we just show them a little bit more charity?
I think actually a lot of good faith has been administered for this government. You know, we've had debates on SpectatorTV defending our editor, Fraser Nelson, defending their decision to delay Freedom Day by 4 weeks. You know,
we were all shocked by that.
You can try to sympathise, but when they have these emergency powers which control our lives in such an extreme way, and when we're talking about not getting rid of all rules, but exchanging the old rules for new rules that are indefinite and potentially completely change the relationship between the individual and the state, sympathy has to go out the window. You have to scrutinize that, because if you don't, you end up, I think, in a much darker place. And let's hope that the cynics are right. Let's hope that this is all a bluff, and that Boris Johnson, the once liberal editor of The Spectator, he said that he would tear up an identity card if he were ever asked to show it and eat it in front of the official who asked for it. Let's hope that deep down in his heart, he comes around and realizes what a bad idea it would be to carve up society based on their health status. But as they're announcing they're going to do it, saying this is coming in without even having gone to Parliament first, I think our only job, Freddie, for the next few weeks is to follow this and be critical and investigate it.
Please subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. You can do that by hitting the button at the bottom of the screen. And also, I'd encourage you to hit the bell, which will remind you every time we produce a new episode.